Now that you know how a static request works, let's take a look at the dynamic request, and let's try to understand how a dynamic request is different from a static request. Now you know that the browser receives a bunch of files from the server, and you know that the browser's job is to merge these files together to produce the web page as you see it in the browser. In other words, the page that you see do not exist. It is always the result of the browser merging different pieces of information together. But what exactly are those pieces of information? Well, the first piece of information obviously is the content. The text, the links, the images, the animations, the PDF files, and whatever else you might have on a website. Now, another piece of information is the structure. That's the HTML tag that wraps that content. Part of the text, for example, are titles. Part of the text is body text. Part of the text is in a table. And that is handled by the HTML structure, which describes the hierarchy of the elements on your web page. Another piece of information is the design, which is mostly handled by the CSS style sheets, which defines fonts, colors, alignments, and so on. Another piece of information are the interactions, which is mostly handled by JavaScript files. In case of a static request, the HTML file contains the structure and the content, and then you have the additional support files, such as the CSS files that contain the formatting and eventually the interactions in the JavaScript files. All those files are sent to the browser, and the browser renders the page. In case of a dynamic request, we further separate things. We have the structure that will be stored in a CFML file, which is a ColdFusion file with a .cfm file extension. And we have the content that will be stored in a database. And we have to merge those two things together to create an HTML code. Now, the rest of the story is pretty much the same as for a static request. We have the additional support files, CSS, JavaScript, images, and we send that all to the browser that renders the page. So this is basically how a dynamic website works. That part of the process takes place on the server. So regardless of the browser that the visitor uses, regardless of the platform that the visitor has, Mac, Linux, and so on, it is always the same server that will perform that step here to merge the structure with the content. That step here takes place on the client side. So that takes place in the browser of the visitor that visits your website. And here things can be a little bit different. So two different browsers in two different platforms, Windows, Mac, or Linux, will not always do the same thing with a single code. And this is something it's a big problem in web development and web design. We need to account for differences in browsers. But as far as ColdFusion is concerned, ColdFusion will do its job before the HTML is sent to the browser. So the ColdFusion server will work the same way regardless of the browser and the platform used by the visitor. Now, how does a dynamic request works? Well, first, the user will type a URL or interact with your page in some way, and that will generate an HTTP request to the server. So far, so good. This is exactly the same story as for a static request. But the server will receive a request to a .cfm file instead of a .html file. And that server will say, hey, that .cfm thing, I cannot handle that myself. I need to pass the request to an application server that is able to understand and process those CFM files. Now, that application server will, if needed, query a database to have access to the content that needs to be sent back to the user. And that application server will merge the content received from the database with an empty HTML structure, will generate that HTML page and send it back to the HTTP server. Now, that HTTP server will in turn send it back to you, to the user of the website, and the browser that is installed on the system of the visitor will render that HTML. Now, take a very close look at the first and the last steps of this process. It's exactly the same as for a static request. It begins by the user interacting with your page, and it ends by the browser rendering the HTML. Now, what are the consequences of this system? Well, the HTML file that is sent back to you, that is sent back to your browser by the server, does not exist. That HTML code is generated on the fly by the application server. It means that a single structure file can be used to render different sets of data. Think of an airline ticket, for example. You have user A that wants to go to Mexico, and user B wants to go to Canada. Well, user A and B will request something to the website, and they will both use the same page to see the result of their request. But user A will see the flights, the airfare, the schedule, the itinerary, etc. to Mexico, and user B will see the very same kind of information but going to Canada. They will both be using the same file, they will both see the same URL in their browsers, but they will see different content. You can also localize content that way. You can detect where a user comes from and serve content in whatever language that user has. So you might have a single page that displays content in French, in Spanish, in English, depending on where the user comes from. You can also automatically update pages. Think, for example, at our agenda in our website. Well, you can query the database and filter the content based on a date. You can, for example, ask the database to give you a list of all the upcoming events. And when a certain date is reached, well, an event that used to be on the upcoming events page will automatically go to the past events page because a certain date has been reached. That's very simple. And you don't have to go to your code and mess around with your code to change that. The browser's job does not change. So the browser will do the very same thing regardless of the request being a static or a dynamic request. The additional files may be needed, just like for a static request, and the browser will simply request those extra files as needed. What are the different pieces of software needed to make this system work? On the client side, we need a web browser, and that can be any web browser. Also, installing and maintaining the browser is the responsibility of each user. There is very little we can do about it as developers. On the server, we need a piece of software that will handle the HTTP requests from our visitors. And while there are a lot of possibilities here, most of the time you will use either Microsoft Internet Information Service, also called IIS, or the open source Apache HTTP server. One of the key differences between the two is that IIS only runs on Windows, while Apache runs on a much wider range of systems, including Windows, macOS, or Linux. For the application server, this is where ColdFusion comes into play, but you can use other technologies as well, such as PHP, .NET, any flavor of Java, and more. For the database, we can use pretty much any database engine, but the most common are Microsoft SQL Server, the open source MySQL Server, Oracle Database, and many more. Providing that the application server can connect to the database, and that is handled by a database connector, you can actually use any database engine you want. In the next chapter, you will install and configure that whole system on your development computer.